Ladies and gentlemen, we are here, the end of the college football regular season, and we do have, I wouldn't say a clear path completely to predicting the four playoff teams, but we do have some clarity. So, taking a look at the ESPN FPI, you can see the Buckeyes still sitting at number one in front of Michigan, even after the loss to Michigan. It makes complete sense considering Ohio State outgained Michigan by over 40 yards. They had some unfortunate turnover luck. They were on the road. But yes, the Buckeyes did lose. They are 11-1, and they are on the outside looking in. Michigan sitting at number two. Oregon moving up 2 spots. Penn State moving up 2 spots. Georgia down 2 spots. Bama. What happened to them against Auburn? They get bailed out late. Auburn inexplicably only rushes 2 there on 4th and goal from the 30-yard line. Just crazy. Texas destroys Texas Tech. They're up 1 spot. Oklahoma down 1 spot. There's Florida State. We're going to talk about them. And then you can see the other team in contention. It is Washington sitting all the way down at number 13 in terms of the FPI. But we're going to mainly focus on strength of record because strength of record always seems to be the deciding factor when it comes to the committee. Right now, Michigan sitting at the number 1 overall spot. They're in an extremely commanding position. They're going to be 22-point favorites over Iowa. There's really not much to discuss when it comes to Michigan. People are saying, should they go to the number 1 team? It's not going to matter considering Georgia faces Alabama. If Georgia beats Alabama, they're going to be number 1 no matter what. So really, whether Michigan is number 1 this week, it's just anecdotal. I'm guessing Georgia will be number 1. Michigan will be number 2. Michigan very likely matching up with someone in that 2v3 matchup. Right now, their strength of record is number 1. You can see Washington's strength of record is number 2. This is what I'm going to say about Washington. If they lose to Oregon, which I expect them to in their conference championship, their strength of record is going to get crushed. I can pretty much guarantee it based off their FPI, based off of some of their close wins, based off of their strength of schedule. I think when it comes to Washington, if they lose in really any form or fashion against Oregon, they are completely out. They do not have the analytics to hold up. That is my opinion when it comes to Washington. Obviously, if they went out, they're in. They had yet another very underwhelming performance against Washington State in the Apple Cup. Michael Penix Jr. has not been nearly as good the past 4 or 5 weeks. The defense is a little bit weak. I don't know about Washington. If they win out, they'll be fine. But if they lose at all to Oregon, they're not getting in. I know some people are saying maybe they'd get in over Ohio State. There's zero chance. Ohio State would be in over Washington if they lose to Oregon. And then that brings us to Florida State. So you can see Florida State right now sitting at number 3 in terms of strength of record. It is an absolute horror scenario for the committee. We understand Florida State. It's very sad. It's very tough losing your starting quarterback, but we simply cannot afford to have another semifinal blowout. And we saw Florida State back in 2014. They went undefeated. They won all these close games. We rewarded them, and we put them in the playoffs against Oregon. And how did they repay us? They got destroyed, and it was a horrible game. And now they've got their backup quarterback. Even their backup quarterback gets injured. They're onto their 3rd string, Brock Glenn. They barely beat a bad Florida team who was also with a backup quarterback. I think with Florida State, if they go undefeated, I would say, listen, what a great season. We're going to reward your team with a trip to the Orange Bowl. And yes, they would be out of the playoff, unfortunately. And I don't like doing that because if you go undefeated, you should be in. But there are some extra circumstances. And even Florida State fans, it's just so tough for that university. But you have to understand, we need close games when it comes to the semifinal. And when you've got Florida State matching up against a team like Georgia, we're really talking about a 49-7 type game. We're talking about a TCU 2.0. That Florida State team doesn't have any juice without Jordan Travis. Even with Jordan Travis, they were involved in some close games against bad teams. So Florida State, I would say, I think the committee, they're going to say, listen, what a great season. We are going to reward you with a New Year's Six Bowl, but you're just going to be on the outside looking in when it comes to the playoff. You had a great season. Congratulations. But we need big-time games, unfortunately. But I do think there's a chance the committee lets Florida State in, depending on how some of these other results go. You can see Georgia sitting at number 4. With Georgia, it's very simple. Win and you're in, lose, and it is a complete mess. Because if Georgia loses to Alabama, Alabama is in. I know people say, well, would Alabama get in? Absolutely, Alabama would be in. But also, Texas would be in guaranteed. You would have Michigan in. You would have the Pac-12 winner in, so probably Oregon. Then you would have Alabama in and Texas. And would they really leave Georgia, who's won the last 2 national titles, out of the college football playoff just for suffering 1 loss to Alabama at the end of the season? I think they would. I guess the argument would be Georgia with 1 loss versus Oregon with 1 loss. That would likely be what it comes down to, because, again, if Alabama wins, Texas has to be in, at least according to what the committee's been doing. Texas is always ahead of Alabama because Texas has the road head-to-head win over Alabama, although we would all agree, well, actually, I don't know. I was going to say, in a rematch, we would expect Alabama to beat Texas, but the way Alabama played against Auburn, I know their fans are coping right now. They're saying, oh, it's a rivalry game. I mean, come on. You had 4th and goal at the 30. You basically lost that game against Auburn, and we're really supposed to take you seriously? I don't know. But either way, if Alabama does win, you kind of have to say it's the argument is going to be a 1-loss Oregon. This is assuming Oregon beats Washington. A 1-loss Oregon versus a 1-loss Georgia. Because, again, Michigan is in no matter what. You would have Texas in no matter what. I don't know what you do with FSU in that spot. That's why, it would have been just, if FSU would have lost last night, it would have been a lot more clear. I guess they might just put FSU in because they're undefeated. It's just so tough when it comes to something like that. But if Alabama does beat Georgia, there's no way they get left out. It's just impossible. Based off, I'm surprised Alabama has the 31st strength of schedule. That is crazy to me. That's very surprising. Maybe it's getting weighed down by a few cupcakes, but either way, I would expect Bama to be in. There's no way if they beat Georgia, they would get left out. That they would find a spot for them at 3 or 4, and you would argue with other teams. My guess right now, and I've talked about this, Ohio State and their chances. When it comes to the Buckeyes, they need a lot to happen. There's no doubt about it. The Pac-12 champ is going to be in over them, undoubtedly. Michigan is going to be in over them no matter what. And you're also going to have a situation where you need Georgia to beat Alabama. If Alabama beats Georgia, very likely both Georgia and Alabama will be in front of Ohio State. They would be out completely. But if Georgia beats Alabama, Georgia's in front. But then Alabama's completely knocked below Ohio State because of the 2 losses. And then the other thing that Ohio State would need, and this is probably the most far-fetched thing of the day, it would be Texas losing to Oklahoma State. Now, Oklahoma State is a very weak team. They made their conference championship. It would have been a lot better for Ohio State if Oklahoma would have made... I mean, we just saw Oklahoma State last night. They almost lost to BYU. Remember Oklahoma State? They lost by 40 to UCF. That's not a good football team. And they're going to get crushed by Texas, I'm guessing. So right now, it does look like there's going to be one team that unfortunately gets left out. Let's say Michigan wins, they're in no matter what, they're insulated. Let's say Georgia wins, they're in no matter what, they're insulated. So now it comes down to an undefeated Florida State without their quarterback, a 1-loss Oregon, and a 1-loss Texas. That's the argument, and I think they would put Oregon in. Now, but I don't know, their strength of record might not be good enough. I mean, think about this. Strength of record always decides it, and Oregon's strength of record, if they beat Washington, it's going to move up significantly. Does it move up to the top 4? I don't know, man. They're at number 9 right now. It's hard to say. Obviously, Oregon has crazy good analytics. They're number 3 in terms of FPI. I do think they would probably put Oregon in. And I think the most logical top 4 right now, if you add all of the factors together, the matchups are going to be, this is just the prediction, the most likely prediction. The number 1 overall seed will be Georgia, and they will be taking on Texas, who will be the number 4 seed. The number 2 overall seed will be Michigan, and they will be taking on Oregon. Those would be the matchups. 1 is Georgia taking on Texas. That game would take place in New Orleans, the Sugar Bowl, and the Rose Bowl in Pasadena would be Michigan and Oregon. That is how I see it right now. Florida State, whether they win or they lose, you're just going to have to reward them and say, listen, you're going to be in a New Year's Six Bowl. It's all right. It's not going to be the playoff, but it'll still be a really good bowl. Maybe they could face Ohio State. Maybe they could face Ole Miss. That's a great consolation prize. There's nothing wrong with that. But there has been an emphasis, especially with the committee, We can't have another situation where, I mean, the issue is if Florida State faces Georgia, what is the spread in that game? Would the spread be something like Georgia minus 14? Georgia minus 17? Like, that's the stuff that you have to avoid. So when it comes to the teams that can still make the playoffs or the playoff, certainly Michigan, they're basically an auto lock. Georgia, Florida State, Washington, Ohio State, they have the lowest chance out of anyone, but they can still make it. Texas, and then Alabama and Oregon, those would be the 8 teams that still have a chance that are still alive. The biggest wrinkle by far would be Alabama beating Georgia, because then that sets up the argument of a one-loss Oregon against a one-loss Georgia. If Washington wins, it becomes a lot more clear. I'll give another scenario with Washington winning. So let's say Michigan wins, Washington wins. They have to be in because their resume is just ridiculous. Even though Washington's had all these close games against bad teams, their resume is crazy. So they would be in for sure, undefeated conference champs of the Pac-12. It'd be Michigan, Washington. Let's say that Alabama does beat Georgia. And let's say that Texas wins. And let's say that FSU wins out. Oh my God, what a mess. The real mess is Alabama beating Georgia, because there's just no way they leave an SEC team out. Like, is the argument Alabama against Florida State, one-loss Alabama versus undefeated Florida State with their backup quarterback? You know, because you also have to consider Texas has to be in front of Alabama. You know, certainly if you're Alabama, you want Texas to lose. I think if I'm an Alabama fan, I'm very confident as long as I win against Georgia, I'm in the playoff. And then if you're a Georgia fan, do you sit there and say if we lose a close game to Alabama, we should be in no matter what based off of the last 2 years? Because right now, Georgia's strength of record, listen, if they lose to Alabama, Georgia is going to be outside of the top 4 in terms of strength of record. I'm just going to say that right now. So, you want to be one of those top 4 teams in terms of strength of record. If Oregon beats Washington, will they be catapulted up that much inside of the top 4? I don't know. We don't have a barometer to really check that. Can Ohio State get back inside of the top 4 in terms of strength of record? They would need Texas to lose. They would need Alabama to lose because both of those teams would stay behind, and they would need FSU to lose. And then Ohio State would very likely be back into the top 4. But that is 3 different teams losing. Seems rather unlikely to me for the Buckeyes at this point. So, again, I would say right now, the matchups, not that I can completely predict them, but the expectation is Georgia will be facing Texas. That game will be taking place in New Orleans. It will be the Sugar Bowl at the Caesars Superdome. And then we will have Michigan facing off against Oregon. That game will be taking place at the Rose Bowl in California, and that will be the 2v3 matchup. Certainly Washington could win. And you would put Washington at number 3, and then Washington would be facing Michigan. You see, and then possibly if Texas loses, you could possibly replace them with, I don't know, maybe FSU. I think FSU is a real mess, and it's so hard because if a team goes undefeated, you want to reward them. But when you have a situation like this where FSU, and this is the death situation that I said could happen, what if FSU barely beats Florida? Florida is starting their backup quarterback. FSU plays uninspired. They play another close game. And we're basically sitting here with a TCU 2.0 situation where let's not do this charade and pretend like FSU can win a game in the playoff. This is not a Cardale Jones situation. Cardale Jones at least came in and beat Wisconsin 59-0. That game against Florida was very shaky. Florida was winning much of it. And Florida's just a completely undisciplined team. That's kind of why they lost there at the end, knocking out the quarterback when it should have been 4th down. They would have been punting. That's neither here nor there, but that is just the situation, how I see it. Yes, if all of these teams win, somebody's going to get left out. It's just the reality. The biggest wrinkle would be Alabama beating Georgia. I don't think it's going to happen, especially the way Alabama played, but I'm also expecting Alabama to play a lot better, and also it was a rivalry game against Auburn, but that would be the craziest thing to happen. Very likely that Oregon beats Washington, in my opinion. Very likely, obviously, that Michigan wins out. Very likely that Georgia wins, and if all those 3 things happen, you would expect those teams to all make it, and then very likely Texas would be the 4 seed in that spot because they would slide in front of Alabama if Georgia beats Alabama. And then you would you would also have Florida State sitting there. The other issue with Florida State is they're really not going to add to their resume at all. But I don't know, will Florida State stay inside of the top 4 in terms of strength of record? The problem with strength of record, it can't take into account injuries. That's the issue, So Florida State might get bumped out, honestly, even if they win. Now, I don't think they will, but it's just they don't have a good opponent here with Louisville losing. Louisville now a 2-loss team, very likely outside of the top 15 in terms of the rankings. Either way, we will see. That's going to do it for this video. Make sure you're following me on X. Link to that's always in the description.